All right, so here we're going to talk about and also design pricing comparison charts. And this is something that you see often on SaaS or software as a service landing pages, where you have multiple tiers in terms of account levels. And I'm going to show you initially here just several different examples just to show you how diverse these are in terms of the layouts and how much flexibility you have. And then also we're going to design our own from scratch afterwards. All right, so here's the first example. It's very simple. It's probably the most simplistic example of all the examples that we have. It has a nice illustration here, kind of representing a single balloon for a trial account all the way to a castle for a business account. And there's only 3 bits of type right here as well. Here's another example where we only have 2 columns. So sometimes, a service may only have 2 different, maybe like a free tier or, one that's paid. And this one is designed really well. They all basically in common, the things that they have in common are the pricing, a plan name at the top, and then also the benefits that are compared against each other. Here's another example. This is more indicative of something that you would see typically where you have 3 different price levels. And these aren't necessarily even in cards, although you'll find that most of them are designed within structured cards, but they don't have to be. As you can see here, there's a good amount of white space between each of these plans so that you can clearly, see the distinction between each of the 3. Here's a good example of the card approach. And also one thing that you'll see that's pretty much typical across all of these, there's a preferred plan, the one that's most popular, and that will be emphasized somehow, sometimes through a high contrast stroke like this, sometimes by making it actually larger, sometimes with an actual drop shadow, and sometimes all 3, as you'll see. Here's another really good example of really emphasizing the preferred pricing plan that's going to be, most popular based on their research. And here's from the same designer. You can see that they've decided to kind of create this an entirely different approach in terms of the layout of the pricing comparison plans. As you can see, there's just 4 here in your typical approach. But then they've kind of added an XY kind of axis where all of the different features and such are on the rows, and then the plans are based on the columns with check marks. And then here's another example. Of course, you can go any color scheme, dark or light, as you wish. And yeah, hopefully at this point now you kind of understand what these are all about. And now we're going to design our own from scratch in Figma. All right, so let's go ahead and get started and create our own pricing structure, pricing comparison chart essentially. And what we'll do is, again, we're always, at this point in the course, we're just working with desktop, and really our focus in all of these different components that we're doing is just to really solidify our eye for UI design fundamentals. So we're gonna go ahead and start here by taking the frame tool, and we'll choose desktop here of 1440. I do kind of like to take the scale in just a bit, so it becomes like 1440 by 890 or so, and this will work just fine. And I know I want to make this kind of like a lighter color scheme, so typically when I'm doing that, I do like to click on the background here and just make it darker. That way I can clearly see, the edges of the frame and the layout itself. Now we always don't have to just go with white for the background. For this one, I'm going to choose to go here in the blue hue somewhere, and we're just going to drop it down in terms of darkness very slightly, and also give it some color by moving right over here. So right there, I like that fine. The color code for that, if you want to follow along, is E2ECF0, right there. Okay, so now what we'll do is let's create the very first card. So you don't want to start off by trying to create all 3 cards simultaneously. You create one because they're all pretty much styled very similar, and then we'll replicate the other ones. And when necessary, we're going to use components for it. So we'll go ahead and take a rectangle tool, and just somewhere around the middle, I'm going to hold the Alt key and then just drag out. Now, right now, I will replicate this just to see how much of the layout in terms of the width that this will consume. So I'm going to duplicate this right here, and then we'll duplicate this over here. And that seems to be pretty good. I like the width of this. So the width of this element happens to be 292. The height we're going to readjust. Actually, I probably make this a tad bit larger right there. Okay, so this happens to be 326, and the height we're going to adjust in a little bit. So when it comes to the background here, In the card itself, you can have high contrast cards, or you can also have low contrast cards. So we're gonna go the low contrast route and just make this white. So if you think it needs to be a little bit more contrast, that's completely fine. We'll take the background here and maybe we'll just drop down very slightly. All right, there we go. So now that happens to be D1E0E7 for the color code. And you can type that in and use the same exact value if you wish, although you don't have to. So the next consideration we have, and this is going to depend on the rest of the aesthetics of the layout, if there's already been one established, if you want to have rounded corners. So for me, I do want to have rounded corners, although slightly. Sometimes you'll see big, thick, bold, rounded corners, and that can work for some branding. Me, I kind of like to keep it a little bit just on the subtle side. So that happens to be 10 for the border radius. All right, so now we're going to start getting on our actual type. All right, so at the top, usually, and this isn't a certainty, sometimes this can change, we'll have the plan name. All right, so I'm going to take the type tool, I'm going to left click right here and go all the way from the very left to the very right while holding the left click button, and then we're going to center this. And it's just a quick and easy way to center, make sure it's absolutely centered inside of the container. So we're going to call this small business, and we have some options here. It all depends on what the rest of the type looks like. So this in and of itself is potentially fine, although a little small. Maybe we'll bump that up to 16 just for now. We're definitely going to change this though. And let's get our other type on just to see how we want to play around with the typographic visual hierarchy, or in other words, styling the different bits of type against each other based on priority. Next we'll have the price. So we're going to keep the price at the top, which is a very standard thing. And we will also have, we're going to assume that this is a monthly service. All right, so right off the bat, before we add that little monthly type, we could see we have an issue with visual hierarchy. These two are styled exactly the same, and we don't want that. So what is more important? Is the name some arbitrary name, or is the price of the plan? Well, I'm going to say it's the price. Therefore, we're going to make this stand out more so. Our goal is to really direct the eye here as much as possible to this price point. And so what we'll do is we're going to increase the size of that. And by the way, let's stick with Poppins. So we're going to take both of these type elements here, and we'll type in Poppins. All right, and that'll work. And we're going to increase the size of this. All right, already our eye is directed more so at that price point rather than just this element. Now we can further increase that typographic visual hierarchy by taking it in the weight and making it bold. Now it really stands out quite a bit. All right, so now we may in the future change these up. It all depends on what we want to do. So next up, we're going to put a little kind of like a little label that says monthly right here. So for that, I'll just take this layer, Control D to duplicate it, and I'm going to click on this element for auto width because we don't need that centered. And we're just going to put it right there, and then we're going to double click and change this to monthly. Also left align it. All right, so this kind of feels off because this is centered absolutely, but then we have this amount of text right here that's kind of offset. So what I would like to do is to take both of these, and by the way, we'll choose auto here for that, auto width, and we'll take both of these and then we'll just center those up. So I like that personally. I think it works pretty well. Now, one thing that we have here is this element and this element are styled exactly the same, which is kind of an issue with, again, what's called typographic visual hierarchy. So one of the things I like to do with some labels, especially labels that aren't necessarily very important, is I like to add this certain aesthetic onto them. And so here's what that involves. First, we're going to make this a bold. Second, we are going to come out here to the options of the type, and we're going to click over here on the all uppercase option. All right, now the advantage to doing that rather than just hitting caps lock and typing small business is that we can quickly change between these elements like that. So let's go ahead to small business. Now it's pretty big now, so we can't stand to make it a little bit smaller. And then perhaps also increase the tracking, so the letter spacing. So I'm just gonna take my keyboard up arrow key, and we're gonna go right around 9%. I think that's pretty good. We can also change the color as well, because right now it is maximum contrast against a white background, it's black. But if we really want the eye to be focused on these two elements more so, we can change the color of this. And a great way to color your type is to just grab whatever color is most apparent in the layout, which happens to be this entire background. So we hit I, and now it becomes that color. Clearly not enough contrast at all. What we'll do then is click on the fill, and then we'll drag down, and we can choose to add more hue, tone, lightness, darkness, etc. So I'm just gonna come down here, and it's kind of up to you. We can go around here, or we can really make it a little bit more color saturated. A lot of this is subjective preference as long as there's enough contrast. And again, you want to check your contrast if you're uncertain. Of course, if you have black on white or white on black, you know the contrast is going to be at 21. It's going to be perfect. However, if you're dealing with something like this and you're not sure, always make sure to select the type layer, right click, go to plugins, click on Stark, and check contrast, and there we go. So it says for normal text, this is normal text, again, we want to be 4.5 to 1. This is for large text. So this is actually small text. We're going to want to increase this right here. So we could come down. Let's see if it's good here. It's at 4.45. We're almost there. So as you can see, it's pretty, I can guarantee you it's going to check it. There we go. So all right, so now we have a good amount of contrast, and we have good typographic visual hierarchy between these elements that's set up pretty well. All right, so now let's go ahead and let us do the actual features. So the features are what are included in that given plan. And there's multiple ways to lay these out, and you'll see that here very shortly. And I'm gonna do multiple iterations of this design. And you'll see how we're really gonna progressively enhance it. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and we'll just take this type right here. It's at 16 for the size, which is perfect. And we're gonna assume this is kind of like a hosting service. So we're gonna put 30 GB, or we'll make that caps lock right there, 30 gigabytes per month. All right, so typically when you have this sort of element where you have like a numerical value that's a part of the feature description, you can completely take that value right here, if it's based on some sort of metric, and we can make it bold. All right, now we could also, just to really reuse our colors a little bit more, we could also, and by the way, a good thing to get in the habit of is like for this color right here, which might be used elsewhere, we're just gonna go ahead and click here, and then we're gonna add that, and we'll call this primary text color, or name it whatever you want. Now we could take this 30 GB as well, and we can select that element. There we go. All right, and that's pretty good. And we can center all these. Everything else is centered. You'll see in another iteration how we'll also left align them and add an icon. But for now, we're just gonna keep this simple. And because this right here is going to be repeated, what we can do is we can right click and create a component out of it. All right, so now we're gonna duplicate this. We want a good amount of white space between these elements, not too much, but not too little. This would be way too close together. This would be way too far, in my opinion. So there's a good middle ground, probably somewhere around here. And again, it depends on how many features as well that you have to design for. We'll just design for this one, maybe about 5 or so. So for the next one, we're gonna put in 2 TB for terabytes, and we'll put storage right here. And one thing that we should probably do is we're going to extend this all the way out because we know we want these to be centered, and then click center. There we go. And that's the magic, of course, of using components when you hand it just this original one versus the instance over here. So now what we'll go ahead and do is replicate this, Control D, move it down. Of course, you want to make sure you get those indicators where it's saying it's 15 points apart. And right here, we'll put 6 and then CPUs. And we'll just replicate this 2 more times. All right, 1 second. I think I didn't grab the actual instance. There we go. And then for this one, we're going to put automatic deployment. We're going to duplicate that as well and put in dedicated support. All right, so those are going to be all of the actual features that we have for this so far. I know it doesn't look great yet, but we're really going to transform this and make it look good here going forward rather. So now the other thing that you see typically is a call to action of some sort that is present on each of the comparison cards. So there's many different ways to add this. We're just going to add a simple button that's aligned to the bottom of the card. And of course, the amount of white space that we have between these elements is something that we also have to be mindful about. So we're going to take our rectangle tool and just for now, we're going to add it just right around here and make it nice and pretty decently large. We could take both these elements and move them up, say right around there. And for the actual color, we could probably reuse our text color that we used here. We don't have to, but let's just see what that looks like. So we're gonna come out here, click that. I think it personally looks great. So maybe we'll make this a little bit larger. And now we need the button caption or the type inside of it. And we'll just replicate this, right click on it and bring to front. And again, to make sure it's centered up, we can do this and move this over here and then center it. And what's wrong now? Well, first we need to give it an actual relevant type, which is purchase. But now we have an issue of contrast. This is a darker background, so if we want to maximize our contrast, we're going to make it white. And we can also make it bold for the caption itself to stick out more. All right, so that's looking pretty good, although one thing to be mindful of, the container itself is rounded, but these are not. So it creates kind of an issue of lack of consistency in the aesthetic of how that rectangle is being presented. So one thing to be mindful of as well, when we give this rounded corners, we don't want it to be the same, like this is 10 here. We don't want to make this 10 as well. And I'll show you why. It doesn't scale down properly. This is a smaller element inside of here because it's situated inside. So what we want to do is scale this down just a few times so that it looks like it really kind of fits within, so to speak. All right, so that is looking pretty good. Right here, this empty white space, there's several different ways that we can enhance this. You could just leave it empty, that's completely fine, but you can also give the layout more structure. Perhaps we can add a line in here. So what we can do is, this is pretty dark. A high contrast border like this is not preferable because it's just a separating element. It's not important like the type. So we don't need this to be high contrast. What we can do is take the eyedropper tool, take the background, and this looks pretty good. It's really low contrast, but it really does help kind of define the two different sections of this layout. Or rather, there's three. There's the heading up here, there's the features, and then there's the call to action. The call to action already has a clearly defined container around it, the button itself, so we don't need to add a border like this. Of course, you want to make sure this is all, you could go all the way out, by the way, to the edges if you wish by holding Alt and Shift. And there we go. That looks pretty solid to me. Now let's see how it looks though when we start replicating this for the other two options. So Control D, and we're going to move this over holding Shift. All right, now let's focus on this element over here. So this is going to be a free plan. Now you might be wondering, maybe we should have taken everything and made that a component as well, but that really doesn't work well when the second iteration or any other iterations start to change in any significant way, like if you're really removing certain layers and stuff. Given that this is a free plan, I think what we'll just do is just we'll put 0 here, and we'll put forever here. Oops, had that reverse caps there. And we're gonna move this over. And then we could select these both rather. Oops. And we can make sure we get the center right there. And then maybe we'll only have 3 options right here. And then we're going to move our call to action button text. Oh, and by the way, we could also make this, in fact, I think that's what we'll do. I'm gonna delete this temporarily. I forgot to make this a component. So we're gonna create a component. We're gonna rename it button. All right, and we'll duplicate that and just put it over here. Make sure that's centered up. And let's move this up right around here. And then we'll move this up as well. All right, and then we'll take this element and we could group it just temporarily and then make sure it's centered, oops, right there. We could also take this right here and we'll group it and we will center that as well. So now we know within this design, everything is centered vertically at this point. So we'll take both of those and just ungroup real quickly. And the reason I'm choosing to ungroup them is just because I'm working with the individual layers and it's easier just to left click once rather than have to double click into the group and access the various elements. All right, so right here, the free plan versus this plan right here, which is the preferred plan. Yes, this is larger, but you might want to make this a little bit more obvious that it's the preferred plan. And there's a couple ways to do that. Additionally, you might want to change up the button right here, the button design itself. That way we can kind of keep this one as being the most preferred, and that will help further reinforce the idea that this is the preferred plan. And so the way we can do that, we can double click into this and select this background right here, and we can change the fill color. Perhaps we could just do add it and make it white. And of course we can't see anything now, but we can also add a stroke, and the stroke color here could be right here. We'll double click into here, make sure to select the text. And then for the text, we could also make this color. All right, so now we've kind of enforced the visual hierarchy and really emphasize it on this middle card more so than the free plan. All right, so now what we can do is take this element, or this card rather, and just situate it over here. And now we'll do a secondary plan, or a third plan rather, called Big Business. This will be the most expensive plan, but not quite as popular as the other one. $99 monthly. All right, we'll take these two. All right, and then I'm just gonna leave these here. Typically you might actually have more, but for now, just for the sake of the fact that we're not doing a real actual project here, we're just focused on design, we'll just leave it as is. And there we go. So this would be one of the ways that we can emphasize this. Now, going back when I mentioned that we kind of want to maybe emphasize this, that this is the preferred plan more so, one way you can do that is around the entire card is we can add a stroke. So for the stroke, let's go ahead and just add this right here. And maybe you can bump it up just slightly, maybe to 2 pixels. And then we also don't want this extending all the way out. We'll get it right to the edge. And I'm holding shift while just left clicking and selecting and moving those points in. And there we go. We could also stand probably to separate these out a little bit more. So I'm gonna move this over here just with my left and right arrow key. And if we move it like this, we'll make sure we're exactly even at 25. All right, there we go. There's the very simple pricing plan. So what we can do is I'm going to experiment by just really playing around with this to show you that you have a lot of options. So I'm gonna Alt, Shift, and left click and drag this over here. And let's go see what else we can do to just show you that you have options. So for instance, if we wanna make this stand out maybe perhaps a tad bit more, we could take this card background and we can add a drop shadow. So let's see how we can add an effective drop shadow, because drop shadows are one of those things that especially aspiring and new designers get wrong typically. So let's add a plus, and by default here in Figma as it stands currently, it's a drop shadow that's added by default. Now, the type of shadow that's added here is very subtle. You can see it's just down here, but we could stand to make this even larger. So what we can do is come out here to the settings, and for the X and Y, let's just add around 12 and 12. Now this here is just too much. Whenever you're working with shadows, more often than not, you want them to be really low contrast, and this is just too high contrast. It demands too much attention from the eye. So it really should be almost unnoticeable. The blur can also help disperse that contrast or lower that contrast. So if we bump this up, it's a large soft shadow. Now what we can do here is come out here. Now here's a trick as well. If you look at the color of the shadow, it's really gray. That's because it's based on a black color. But if we come out here and we change it, we'll grab the background color that it sits on, and then we'll just give it some color here. So now it looks much more natural and not so gray. And you can either try to get the exact color right here, or we could come out and make it high contrast and just drop down the opacity like this. And this works pretty well. One thing that's frustrating me is because these other cards, this is extended by accident. We want to take this and just move that in, and we'll do that over here as well. There we go. Okay. And there we go. So now we have two different options. One isn't necessarily better than the other. I would say at this point it's pretty much a subjective preference, and you can really have fun and just experiment with the XY blur and spread values as well as the opacity. The opacity for this one I might even want to drop down just a bit more. All right, so let's see what else that we can do with this. We can further increase the fact that this is preferred, which we don't necessarily have to do, by doing what I'm about to do here. So this white color of these two secondary colors, the ones that aren't preferred, we can go ahead and we can change the color to the background, and we'll come up just somewhere in between them. Very subtle. It's almost white, but it's not. All right. Now, what we could also do to kind of bring more attention to the plan right here is we can add a background or like a rectangle behind it. So I'm going to take the rectangle tool, Alt left click, and just kind of get it situated here. I'm looking at the amount of white space on the top versus right and left, and also to make sure it's centered up. And what we'll do is make this white, and we'll give it a little bit of rounded corners, and we're going to drop this down, and of course we'll want to make sure that it's right there. There we go. That way we can see it's on top of the card. And of course this is very, very subtle. We might even want to adjust things so that this is up a little bit closer, and we want an equal amount of white space underneath as opposed to the top as well. All right, so you can see it's very subtle. Might be even hard to see on the video, but I'm just moving this over, and we will drag that down. And again, we're gonna bring this up just a few times as we did on the left. All right, kind of seeing how these align up. There we go. So the baseline, these are all lined up. And so that's one option. Now, when you have a container like this, this line becomes unnecessary. All right, so just notice when I remove those, or when it's present, it just seems like it's unnecessary clutter. So let's just get rid of those. All right, so now we kind of have an issue where there might be a little bit too much white space, but I'm not gonna be all that anal. Typically, maybe I would move these up a tad bit. In fact, I think that's what we'll do. We'll go ahead and move these up, and then also move these up. And then we'll take the bottom of these two and get those all situated. And there we go. So as you can see, when we compare these, this center one demands a lot more attention than these here on the left and right. Now we can keep on going further just by experimenting with different layouts here. One thing that we could do is, let's see what it looks like without a border. So let's remove that border. See, because we do already have a drop shadow, which helps, rise it up off the page, so to speak. And we also created less contrast on the secondary cards. And so this still really stands out as being the preferred payment method. Now let's try another option here. And one of these may not be, preferable over the other, but let's see what having the same exact button design looks like across all three. So I'll duplicate this over here, right click and bring to front. All right, and this will change to, well, for now we're gonna leave that there and just duplicate this and drag it over. And then we'll change this to free. All right. And so now you can make the determination. You could even send this off to the front end developers. They can set up some A/B split testing where some of the traffic is sent to this version with the call to actions looking like this versus this version with the call to actions looking like this, and then analyze the results. A small change like that could actually impact the number of orders you get, believe it or not. And that is essentially going to be it. However, one more thing I want to do, which I almost forgot about, is I do want to show you that you can create an alternative layout for the features here in the middle. As it stands, this is pretty solid as is, but I just want to show you how you can create that alternative layout. So I kind of just sped this part up here just to show you that these are now all left aligned instead of being centered here just in this center card. And we could also add, and you can see it works pretty well like that alone, but we could also add a checkbox. So Iconify plugin, type in check, and we'll add this, we'll just drag it. All right, we'll close that out. And now we can add a checkbox, or check mark rather, right here. I'm just holding Shift and Alt to scale that down. And the color that we can use, typically when it comes to a check mark, you can use green, even though it's not found anywhere else. So we can come here to the color picker somewhere, and somewhere just kind of like a mid-tone green works well. And this would definitely not work well because there's not enough contrast, but coming down around here somewhere will work quite well. 7D8863 is the color code. And then we can just go ahead and duplicate this and then duplicate it again. Sometimes getting these lined up might be tricky. Might be best just to take these and make them a part of a new component. And there we go. So the intention here would be also to adjust these in the same aesthetic as this, and it would work just as well. But for now, this is already a long video, and I think you get the point. You have many options.